he's not here,
Chris isn't here tonight.
but others from the library who put so much effort into making sure that this works. There's a lot of effort that goes into setting up this room, getting the content right, all of that. So they really deserve our full thanks. Also, I'd like to thank Robin Martin today because our speaker is halfway around the world. Robin is the one who coordinated, making sure all these things work and everything gets going. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to make two quick points and put what we're going to discuss in context. So first of all, what we're discussing is the relationship between the U.S. and China. And I think the title of the article that was in the book, which was very good, was navigating U.S.-China relations in a tense time. So that's certainly what's happening. Now, there's an article that came out a while ago, but was just republished by Richard Haas, who was the chair of the Council of Foreign Relations for many years, and still, I think, the president emeritus or something. It's a very interesting article, and if you see it, you get Foreign Affairs, you see it's worth reading. World orders come to an end, and you should make no mistake about it. This world order is coming to an end. The one that was set up after the Second World War, which we call the International Rules-Based Order, is things are changing to make that war, that the world order no longer viable. He points out that the last successful world order was set up by the Congress of Vienna in 1915 and lasted more or less for 100 years. And obviously, when it ended, we ended up in the conflagration of World War I. And Richard Haas's point is these world orders don't have to end that way. It depends upon the skill of the national leaders, the diplomats, the statesmen, to understand the changes that are taking place and have been taking place peacefully. There are two requirements in his view for a successful world order. One is a rough balance of power between strong nations, and the other is adherence to the rules of the road. And we often see that the balance of power is changing today. It won't be long, another few years until China and India are the number 2 and 3 economies in the world at the expense of Russia and Europe. And in terms of adherence to the rules of the road, the rules for world trade were set up in the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs in 1845. And those were the rules that were supposed to prevent various countries from manufacturing to the point where they were subsidizing their manufacturing and then exporting those subsidies, and you get imbalances in trade, and obviously that is what happened. And now we in the United States not following the rules of the GATT, which is now the WTO. So this world order, as I said, is coming to an end. And the other short thing I'll add is that just to show how fast things are changing, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute put out a study a few weeks ago in which they measured what countries lead in various technologies. And they look at 64 different technologies. They measured it 20 years ago. Of the 64 technologies that they picked, the U.S. was ahead in 60 of them.
Okay,
60 out of 64.
6 out of 64.
And China was ahead in 4. They measured again just like a year ago. The U.S. was ahead in 7. China was ahead in 57. So that's the way that's change we're seeing in the world. And we see this in work in robotics, quantum computing, all these various advanced technologies that we're picking. So with those two brief but wanting to set the context comments, I will turn it over to our presenter for today, who is Drew Thompson. Drew was the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He knows this area inside out. And he is currently a senior fellow at the University of
The S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies.
And Drew spent a lot of his time growing up here. He's the son of Jody and Louise Thompson. So you may know him from that, but with Drew, we thank you so much for getting up early on your side of the world and coming and presenting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk. Yeah, just to supplement the introduction, thank you. That was very generous. I spent most of my adult life growing in Asia. After growing up in Shelter Island in New York, one of my good friends, some of you may know, Bobby DeStefano, we grew up together. He described me as the only person he knows who went on a college semester abroad and never came back. So there's some truth to that. I was a student in China and Beijing University in 1990, right after the Tiananmen incident, followed by graduate work in Nanjing, and then I lived in China for 10 years before coming back to the States, and now I've been in Singapore for the last 7 years. I should also point out that when I worked in the Department of Defense, I worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, but I served as a civil servant working in both the Obama and the first Trump administrations. So in my heart, I'm a career civil servant. I'm not politically oriented. I'm a registered independent in the state of Virginia. So what I'll try to do here is analyze the Trump administration's approach to Asia, and as well as U.S. alliances in the region. I'll touch on U.S.-China and cross-strait relations, so that the U.S.-China-Taiwan trilateral dynamic. And then at the very end, maybe if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about how Southeast Asia is adapting to the new geopolitical environment. I think Kurt just teed this up very well, talking about world order coming to an end. So starting out with what I'm seeing in the Trump administration, and again, I'm going to caveat, I don't consider myself a Trump administration supporter, but I do consider myself an analyst, and I'm trying to analyze what the administration's doing and what the impact is on U.S. foreign policy and its relationships around the world. So I think it's worth really starting out with a quick review and recognizing that the Trump administration entered office with a very strong mandate for change. Also entered in with a very ideologically driven agenda. But I think what's most impactful is this sense of real urgency and a strong focus on tangible accomplishments and really outcomes. And having worked in government, sometimes U.S. government can focus on the inputs and not the outputs. I think Kurt, as a diplomat, would probably agree, though he may not like it. But oftentimes we look at we had a meeting, or we had a diplomatic engagement, or we had a conference, but we don't talk about what the outcomes were. We don't always measure what the impact was. And I think that's something that Trump and many of his team have rejected. They don't care what you did, they care what happened. So as a result, you've got a very high tolerance for risk within this administration. They are very unafraid of disruption and change. And they really want to see, if you will, action. Less talk, more action, more outcomes. And they're very driven by that. So that's resulted in some of the chaos that we've seen, many of the hiccups, the really poor execution of many initiatives. But that's not what they value. They would prefer poor execution over no execution and deliberation. So he's really put pressure on his people to produce and not just deliberate. And as a result, this has been a very fast-moving, action-oriented administration, the likes of which we really haven't seen before. I think another major factor that's worth considering is that he has pretty complete control of Congress, especially the House. And by threatening to primary almost any House members in the Republican caucus that oppose him, He has immense power. Congress is not acting as a check on the White House. And of course, he also has a conservative Supreme Court, which gives him just overall tremendous political power. Um, and again, as a effectively second-term president, he is not fettered by the need to get reelected. So he can pick and choose when he wants to pander to his base voters, and he's less tied to winning undecided and centrist voters. And I think it's also worth noting he has a real lack of respect for existing norms, right? His willingness to use disinformation is a trait. It's a feature. He's doesn't have personal restraint the way previous presidents have had. So he's unafraid to use his power. And I think that's a real source of the political, social, and economic disruption that we're seeing. So he is causing disruption. And again, I try to be careful not to assign a value or a judgment, whether it's positive or negative. My effort is to try to analyze and understand the changes taking place, not just judge them, whether I think they're good or bad. All of this affects Trump's foreign policy, not just towards China, but towards the world. And I think that's why it's important to see sort of that top level. And as Kurt pointed out, there's tremendous imbalances in the world economy that we've seen over the past 40 years of globalization. And it's really created winners and losers. And Trump has really connected with the voters, with the American people who do not feel that globalization has benefited them. So globalization has really brought massive imbalances in trade, in workforce, in technology, everything. And I think Trump is also acutely aware that he sees the US essentially on the brink of insolvency. And some of those imbalances that really drive him are the trade deficit. And the US has it's around 1 trillion, $1.2 trillion annual trade deficit. The US government also has a 2 trillion budget deficit every year. And from that, you've got $32 trillion in accumulated debt, which results in over $1 trillion in annual interest payments on that debt. And Trump doesn't feel that this is sustainable. And many people don't. You remember the Tea Party movement of 10 years ago. The Tea Party movement is gone, but many of those people who are dissatisfied with the lack of US government fiscal responsibility have migrated into the Trump supporting camp. So the US has also seen the hollowing out of its manufacturing industry. The US lost 6 million jobs in the manufacturing sector following China's accession into the WTO in 2001 over the next decade. So Trump has really tapped into that national angst to come to power. And he's continuing to play to his base in his both domestic and his foreign policy. So with that backdrop in mind, the overarching foreign policy drivers is very much about economy. And Trump is really trying to redefine the United States economic relationship with the entire world. And he is just rejecting that existing trade paradigm. He's rejecting the differentiation between developed economies who can protect their markets and developing economies whose markets are supposed to be more open to global exports. So he's attempting to establish a new global trade regime based on reciprocity. So the tariffs are a key part of that economic relationship with the world, both in his desire to achieve the goal of onshoring and reindustrialization, creating new manufacturing jobs, but also to help balance the government budget through net new revenues. And his other major priority, of course, is maintaining the tax cuts that he implemented in his first term. So basically, he's trying to offset the lost revenue from income taxes cuts with new tariffs, which is why in all the negotiations that we've seen with countries, their tariffs are a feature of every relationship, regardless of whether we have a trade surplus or deficit with them. So with tariffs as the driver, you've got two other big schools of thought within the administration. You've got the Asianists And then you've got the libertarians, sometimes called the MAGA isolationists. And the article that was forwarded around, I try to explain a little bit more how that affects Asia policy. What's important is that the Asianists are really in key positions to put forward proposals in front of the Trump administration. The vice president is one. The undersecretaries of defense and state for policy, or both, have spent their career working on Asia, focused on China, focused on the Korean Peninsula. So their core belief is that the U.S. should not get involved in global conflicts. They should avoid military interventions and really build and maintain the capability to fight a very high intensity, high tech war in the Western Pacific against China. So they see the value of U.S. allies in the region, primarily Japan and Australia, mostly in the context of deterring China or fighting it if deterrence fails. So simply having allies and alliances are not seen as an inherent good unless they're contributing to the campaign against China. And we're seeing that affect the European relationships as well. So those Asianists want NATO to take greater responsibility for their own security, do more to counter Russia on their own without dependence on the United States, and focus in Europe so that the US can focus more on the Western Pacific. So all allies are expected to invest a lot more in their own defense and be much more capable security partners and much less dependent on the US. And that really is part of the world order that's changing, that the US is not going to be the underwriter of security for the globe. There's also the other school of thought, which are these libertarians who really do agree with that argument that the US should not have its forces deployed all over the world, that we should not be entangled in global conflicts, that we shouldn't have soldiers fighting in the Middle East. They also agree that Europe should take greater responsibility for their own defense. They call for US troops to be recalled from Europe and based back in the States. And they agreed to make accommodations to Russia to resolve the conflict over Ukraine. So they really are accommodationists, and they're much more isolationist than actually Trump himself. So Trump, of course, isn't really ideological. He keeps his own counsel. So we can't really tell if he's inherently isolationist, like his MAGA base, or if he's supportive of the China hawks that he's appointed and occupy these key positions around him. So I think we should definitely, the Trump administration has been described as isolationist, and I don't think that's accurate. They're not isolationist. There are certainly calls not to be involved in conflicts around the world, but Trump has been very involved in foreign policy issues. We've seen him attempt to mediate the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He's very involved with talks in the Middle East. There are U.S. negotiators camped out in Doha and in Qatar trying to resolve the Israeli Gaza conflict. And then Trump was also very involved in the Cambodia-Thailand conflict as early as this weekend, which resulted in a ceasefire agreement yesterday. And if you look at the Cambodia-Thailand joint statement that came out at the end of the talks on Monday, the President Donald Trump features very prominently in them. So clearly he was an influential factor that drove both sides to the table that resulted in a ceasefire. So between that, the trade negotiations, Trump is not isolationist. He's very involved. But what he's trying to do is reserve U.S. hard power, particularly the military, for a future conflict with China. So it's also clear another key factor in U.S. foreign policy is that the Trump administration is very dismissive of multilateral institutions, whether it's the WTO, the United Nations, ASEAN here in this region, APEC. So it doesn't matter whether it's diplomatic, economic, security. He sees multilateral organizations as effectively diluting American power, which is not untrue. He also, of course, doesn't like them for personal reasons because it doesn't put him front and center of an event as an activity. So his narcissistic tendencies tend to prejudice him against multilateral organizations. So, but that said, that doesn't mean he's isolationist. Again, it's also about disruption. He's changing the order. So overall, in U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. is trying to maintain its preeminence. And that's become much harder. It's become much more costly, largely in light of China's rise, growing assertiveness. And it's not just that America is becoming weaker, it's that China's becoming stronger, and that in a relative sense, US power is seen as declining. So he's trying to maintain that preeminence, whether it's in technology, whether it's in hard security, or whether it's in economic competition. And other countries are starting to bear that cost. Singapore's defense minister back in February at the Munich Security Conference described the United States in very sort of stark terms. He said that we used to see America as a liberator, then we saw them as a disruptor, but now we see them as a landlord seeking rent. And if you understand when people talk about rent-seeking behavior in international relations or in political science, it's very pejorative. It's very negative. Um, but but the Singapore defense minister, the former defense minister, he's correct. The U.S. is calling on its allies to make greater contributions to international security, spend more on their own defense, make some very politically uncomfortable commitments to actually deter aggression, whether in Europe or in Asia. And we're seeing that pressure placed on allies in both Europe and Asia. The Financial Times a couple days ago reported that the US government was putting a lot of pressure on Japanese and Australian counterparts to actually be much more specific and upfront about how they would support the United States in the event of a conflict with China over Taiwan. And of course, Japan and Australia are reluctant to talk specifically about how they're preparing to go to war with China. But that's the pressure that the U.S. is putting them under. We can talk more if you want in the Q&A about security relationships and cooperation, but clearly that's part of the disruption that the Trump administration is driving. The Australian defense minister, the British defense minister is currently in Australia, and yesterday he was quoted as saying that the UK is very supportive of US preparations for conflict and deterrence efforts in the Western Pacific. And he said this on board one of the UK's aircraft carriers while it was docked in Australia on its Asian tour. So Trump is having an effect on declared foreign policies of US allies, and he is directing them to become more capable, more committed at deterring China from using force, and then supporting the United States if those deterrence efforts fails. So again, a lot of the hard security focus of US foreign policy is towards China, but also about the US and the world, especially on the economic sector, right? The US is negotiating with almost every country on the planet to renegotiate their trade relationships. So it's not just about China, but on the security front, clearly China is the priority. So in some ways, because the US is redefining its economic relationship with the world, that's somewhat reassuring to Beijing. It's not just about them. And it incentivizes Beijing to step back a little bit, see how this plays out, let the United States make mistakes, and let Washington's strategy play out. And honestly, Beijing would be very satisfied if Washington can destroy some of its relationships with its closest friends and allies, but there's no evidence that that's happening yet. So China is obviously very concerned about the Trump administration. The US-China relations are probably the worst I've seen them since my first trip to China in 1990. And that's a function of changes in China as well as the United States. So I think the biggest changes really started taking place in the bilateral relationship since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. And it's really fundamentally changed. And part of Xi Jinping's worldview is not just seeing the US as an adversary, but many other parts of the world, the West, but really anybody not in the Communist Party itself Xi Jinping sees them as an ideological adversary. And he sees intense competition in multiple domains: political, economic, industrial, technological, military, and also informational, right? So Xi Jinping sees the US and the West as a threat to the Communist Party's survival. Um, you can argue it's not just the West. It's anybody who's not in the Communist Party that doesn't share their ideology. And I think that intense focus on the risk that the Communist Party faces, which he brought to power with him, has then translated into an effort to make the party more resilient, stronger, more unified. And that's resulted in pretty dramatic internal changes within China to isolate it and insulate it from the world. And there's been a number of means, right? Censorship, the elimination of civil society, societal controls, policing, technology used to police the Chinese people much more closely, very ubiquitous censorship and societal controls. And also through industrial policies. Made in China 2025, which is in the 13th five-year plan, is very explicit about making China that leading technological and manufacturing power. It's essentially the core of their industrial policy. Dual circulation is part of the 14th five-year plan and is specifically intended to make China's economy self-sufficient, that less dependent on foreign economies, international economies, other countries' trade, and make those countries much more dependent on China. So those are stated policies with very complex and comprehensive plans to back them and ensure implementation, and all of which seeks to reduce China's dependence on foreign economies, making foreign economies much more dependent on China. So it's effectively a form of selective decoupling, and China has really led the way in this. So I think the Trump administration and the first Trump administration really started out with some optimism that the two sides could solve their differences and negotiate a much more equitable reciprocal trade relationship. And Trump came into office, like many, trying to fix the China relationship. But by 2017, it was pretty clear he had failed. He tried to get China to agree to have reciprocal market access, but again, China's industrial policy, its trade policy really doesn't permit that because of Xi's perception of the threat that an open economy, an open society, and foreign dependence would all pose to the Communist Party and its survival. So the Biden administration really didn't even have that optimism, unlike Bush, Clinton, Obama. All of those administrations really entered into office trying to solve challenges in the relationship, try to strengthen it, make it more stable. The Biden administration basically gave up. They used the Trump administration's playbook. They had almost no internal debate about changing the relationship with China, and they effectively just ramped up efforts to protect US markets, deny China access to technology. They kept all of the Trump administration's tariffs on China and added their own, added more technology controls, and all of that pressure had two negative impacts. Did not change China's pursuit of technological and economic resilience and independence, and it also didn't meaningfully open up China's markets to US exports. So bilateral engagement also withered significantly in the Biden administration. I think if you look back over the Bush administration, had a very high-profile framework for engaging China called the Strategic Economic Dialogue. It was led by Secretary of Treasury Hank Paulson, who's the somewhat legendary Goldman Sachs CEO. And you had a very comprehensive, coordinated approach to engaging China at a fairly large scale. Failed to open up China's markets, failed to resolve trade deficits, failed to stop intellectual property theft. But it was large scale and it was coordinated, and that was actually a really big innovation. And you'd have meetings with 100 people on each side talking about all the different aspects of the relationship. And that at least felt good. And it gave us assurances that the decline of the relationship was going to be much more managed rather than necessarily reversed, but it was actually not going to be out of our control. And then in the Obama administration, you had a much larger engagement framework called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. Instead of just the Strategic Economic Dialogue, you now had Strategic and Economic Dialogue. So basically, two tracks, over 150 to 200 people per engagement at one time, all meeting in the same plenary sessions and breakout sessions to manage all the different aspects of the security and economic relationship between the two sides. So you went from a fairly large to an extremely large engagement framework. By the time the Trump administration comes in, we got down to what was known as a 2+2 arrangement. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, handful of aides on both sides. So we went from 150 people on a negotiating team down to 25. Much smaller, much more focused. Trade, economic, commercial negotiations withered even further. Some of the US-China trade and economic engagement dialogue mechanisms that have been in place since the 1980s effectively stopped by 2017 and haven't been held since. So the ability to engage China has really narrowed. And in this administration and in the Biden administration, you got down to tiny meetings involving essentially the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, engagement in the military to military engagement also shrunk dramatically. So engagement has really shrunk from 100 to 150 to 25 to 8. So you've got smaller and smaller groups of people actually interfacing and managing each other at the highest levels, and the relationship has withered as a result. Competition has increased, but bilateral engagement is smaller. By the end of the Biden administration in I think it was November 2024, so around election time, you had the APEC meetings, and the only agreement that came out of the bilateral side meetings was that the two sides announced that they would ensure that humans would continue to be determining when nuclear weapons would be used, not AI. So no agreement, no treaty, no MOU, but basically a verbal discussion and then verbal statements at the end that the two sides agreed we wouldn't use computers to nuke each other into oblivion. So this is not exactly an arms control treaty, but it gives you a sense of really what the priority for the two presidents was in November 2024, right? This became the most important thing that we needed to discuss. And quite frankly, I don't think the Trump administration is going to fare much better. There's meetings going on as we speak in Sweden to talk about tariffs and trade. But again, China's on a path. It's on a development path. It's on a political path that's really not based or predicated on improving relations with the US. So how's China responding to Trump? I think initially as the relationship evolved in the first couple of weeks and months, China wanted to step back and observe calmly, not overreact, not escalate, except when they were pressed, such as with the April tariff announcement. China was the only country which retaliated against the Trump tariff announcements in April by announcing rare earth embargoes and reciprocal tariffs. So every other country agreed to sit down and negotiate a new tariff regime with the US, but except for China. Both sides agreed ultimately to back down, and they've reached some sort of trade agreement, which would return to the beginning of the administration status quo. But that status quo wasn't terribly satisfactory for Washington. And nothing's fundamentally changed for the better other than increased tariffs for Chinese exports on the US side. So Trump has clearly not achieved his own objectives for China, unless his objectives were simply to impose some new tariffs. But some of those tariffs were already in place. So Beijing is going to continue to use reciprocal responses, some asymmetric ones, but not likely to try overwhelming responses or uncontrolled escalation in response to Trump's provocations. And there's a couple of reasons I think for this. Part of the problem is, China's economy is not doing well. Their approach to COVID was based on lockdowns and turned into an absolute disaster, political disaster, social disaster, and an economic one. It was traumatic for China's society. There were over 2 million deaths from the unplanned end of zero COVID policy in China, and they really haven't recovered yet. Xi Jinping has also effectively neutered the private sector. He's favored industrialization over market development and consumption, consumer consumption. So China's heavily dependent on export markets rather than making foreign markets dependent on China, which is the goal of dual circulation. So he's not actually achieving his trade objectives either. And economic growth has slowed in China. Unemployment's risen to the point where now the Communist Party is struggling to count it effectively and is more concerned with projecting good numbers over real numbers. So I think public confidence within China on its economic development model is very shaken. And to compensate for the loss of the Chinese government's credibility and its ability and confidence in it to continue to grow the economy, it's turning really to political assertiveness. And I think Chinese academics and officials that I talk to, they recognize that China's challenges are largely of their own making, and really Xi Jinping's making. They recognize that the solutions to China's problems really lie from within, not without. And there's debate within Beijing about there's schools of thought effectively between leftists and rightists about how to approach the United States under Trump. And there's liberals who argue for essentially lowering tensions with the US, for engaging, for not escalating, even when provoked, accommodating the United States, even potentially opening up Chinese markets to more competition as a way to reform and liberalize, which is what we saw in the early 2000s and late 1990s, where Chinese leaders saw reform and openness as a means to build resilience and grow the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping sees it much the other way, and the hawkish voices in Beijing seem to have more control. They recommend more assertiveness, more decoupling, leveraging US allies against Washington, carving out spheres of influence, and really countering the US much more firmly. And we see that in political outcomes in China. Extensive meetings this spring in Beijing about strengthening China's relations with its neighboring countries. Xi Jinping has been traveling in the region. In April, he went to Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, which are increasingly becoming important destinations for Chinese companies to invest and do manufacturing offshore from China, and using those countries as manufacturing bases to defeat US tariffs, and to take Chinese inputs, assemble them in Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia as well, and then re-export to the US and to Europe by avoiding trade barriers to China. So Beijing is not entirely sure what to make of Trump. They have their own isolationists. They have their own hawks. So some people in Beijing are hoping for a trade deal, but that's not really why they're restrained in their pushback on China. It's really about the weakness of their economy. And I think a lot of the scholars in Beijing think that China's energies are better spent dealing with their own economy, not fighting with the United States. And again, a lot of this is due to COVID, right? After the Olympics in 2008, China's economy was screaming. It was doing great. China was moving to the center of the world stage, as they say, politically. The mantra was that China is rising and the US is declining, and that there are changes unseen in a century, which is very much Xi Jinping speak. But COVID has really derailed that, and China hasn't yet recovered. So that, I think, is maybe a cause for some confidence that the US-China relationship will find a floor, because China's not looking for a conflict, because they don't see themselves as strong. There's also confidence that the US can't stop China's development. They can't contain it. But there's no confidence anymore that China can overtake the US in economic growth, even with its success in technology, where it is increasingly leading in key areas like electric vehicles in particular. So China recognizes at the end of the day that the US is still the undisputed world leader in military, technology, economy, finance. You know, the US dollar is still the global reserve currency of the world, and the renminbi is not catching up. China's a still very distant second. Um, and also, when Beijing, I think, looks at the rest of the world, it sees a political environment that favors it. And in some cases, it actually sees weakness. It sees Europe as politically divided. It sees the EU as rather ineffective, easy to divide and subvert. The US has been, or the EU has been unable to stop China from supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine because they're afraid of political escalation or economic retaliation. So in Europe, mostly they're now quibbling over the definition of legal support rather than holding China to account for supporting the military industrial complex in Russia. So European leaders are also very concerned about continuing trade with China more than they are winning the war in Ukraine. And part of that's driven by Trump. And we just had an EU deal that most European leaders don't like. They've committed to more market access for US goods. So I think we just saw that the tariffs on US cars in Europe are currently 10%. They're going to drop to 2.5%. At the same time, the tariffs for the EU is going to go up to about 10% or 15%, I think I saw. Again, these numbers are very hazy and no idea how they're going to be actually implemented and where there'll be carve-outs and exemptions. But I think Trump feels like he's getting what he wants, especially from Europe in that respect. And China sees that too. And China sees that the US is effectively bullying Europe to get what it wants. And that's part of the disruption, part of the world order shifting. And the fact that Europe won't push back on China as it supports Russia's war in Ukraine makes them see weakness. I think it was, no one's quite sure whether it was Marx or Lenin who saw the great line, the last capitalist that we hang will sell them the rope that we hang them with. They see that in Europe, and they see that as an advantage. You look at Japan, the Japanese government's been dramatically weakened after the elections last weekend. The Prime Minister, Ishiba, had to deny reports in the press that he would resign, and clearly those media leaks were from his own party. So he hasn't agreed to resign, but I think his resignation in the near future is pretty certain. And his party is losing control of the parliament, so the Diet. So I think Japan is going to be in some political chaos for the near future, and it's going to be weakened politically. South Korea also just gone through some pretty traumatic political problems. They just impeached their conservative president following a failed coup. They've just elected a liberal, Lee Jae-myung, who is rather pro-China and anti-Japanese, which causes all sorts of issues for China's or for the U.S.-Korea alliance, especially when the Trump administration's goal is to mobilize our allies against China. One of our key allies in Northeast Asia is becoming pro-China. Taiwan, also political issues that the U.S. has to contend with. The ruling party under President Lai Ching-te, who Beijing absolutely despises, just suffered a major political defeat this weekend in a recall campaign against 26 opposition legislators. So Taiwan president has just spent an awful lot of political capital trying to shift the parliament, the legislative yuan, into the majority control for his party and failed completely. So we're going to have some weak leadership in Taiwan as well. So there's actually some validity to the Trump administration's perception and skepticism about its allies' own credibility and willingness to stand up to common threats, which is why Washington is seeking assurances. And I think if you look at the global South, they're all keen to engage China. They're supportive in the UN, and they're not concerned about human rights. and they're eager to gain all the benefits from Chinese investment and trade and the Belt and Road. We see the BRICS, we see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they're all expanding. And that's part of China moving to the world stage. And China, of course, is very credibly touting itself as a source of political stability and a staunch supporter of free trade. Now, not everybody in certainly in Southeast Asia or in the developing world believes that, but they like what they're hearing, and they're hoping that they can use that as leverage to get China to open their markets more to their products. So I think Beijing assesses the international environment is pretty favorable, and that its main challenges are domestic. Let me jump to maybe Taiwan very quickly, and then I'll spend a minute or two on Taiwan, and then I think it's about time for Q&A. Kirk, is that right?
Yeah, that would be good.
So, I mean, as I mentioned in Taiwan, Chinese officials are always point out in every single meeting that Taiwan's the most sensitive issue in the relationship. It's potentially really volatile, and I think probably the most likely cause of a future conflict in Northeast Asia. The entire polity of Taiwan and society have really rejected closer ties with China. The trend is Taiwan moving politically and socially away from China. Identity polls where people are asked, do you see yourself as Taiwanese or Chinese or both, over the last 20 years have very dramatically shifted towards a Taiwan identity. People say, I am Taiwanese, 85%. A small portion say that I'm Taiwanese and Chinese, but a very, very small minority, less than 1%, see themselves as Chinese. So if you go back in like 2019, there were about 1 million Taiwanese people living in China, and today it's closer to about 150,000. Most Taiwanese businesses have left China and reshored to Taiwan or set up their shops and their manufacturing centers in Southeast Asia. So if you look, Taiwan is one of the leading foreign direct investors in Vietnam, for example. So you've got effectively China attempting to grow economic ties starting in really 2010 with the China Economic Cooperation Framework. They had a free trade agreement in 2010 that China hoped would make people in Taiwan want to join the mainland in some form of confederation, but it didn't work. More trade, more investment did not create essentially peace between the two sides. And the Taiwan president in 2010, 2011 proposed a peace treaty with China, and the people of Taiwan resoundingly rejected it. And then in 2014, there was an agreement, or there was a proposal by the government to have a cross-strait trade and services agreement to accompany the goods trade agreement in 2014 that led to mass protests and students occupying the legislative yuan, the parliament, for over 3 weeks, and ultimately led to the election of opposition politicians who have no affinity for China and actually are rather supportive of independence. So China has really no realistic hope of peaceful unification with Taiwan. And that leaves Beijing with only threats and coercion, especially military coercion, which we've seen increase pretty steadily. So Beijing's stated intention is to use political and military threats to prevent Taiwan from moving towards independence, because at least it recognizes that it's not winning the hearts and minds in Taiwan through threats and intimidation. So Chinese military modernization is an expansion. I mean, it's the largest expansion of any military since World War II. It's a credible military force. And of course, China's willingness to use its military to coerce its neighbors, and it's not just Taiwan, that includes Japan and the Philippines, 2 US allies, makes that region and that cross-strait dynamic one of the most potential volatile hotspots in the region. So I'm just to give you a sense of how consequential a cross-strait conflict would be. I mean, I think you've all been handed a map, just a party favor, I guess, for thinking about this. And if you look at Taiwan on that map off the southeast corner of China, it sits really across the vital trade routes between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. So any goods coming from the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, has to cross through the South China Sea, go past Taiwan to get to those major economies of Northeast Asia. So Taiwan sits at the base of what's known as the first island chain, running from Japan down to the Philippines. And should China start a conflict around Taiwan, um, it would disrupt trade. It would disrupt, um, uh, of course, Taiwan's economy, and Taiwan is a critical uh, part of the international trade in technology, in electronics, and particularly semiconductors. So Bloomberg um, models the cost of a blockade around Taiwan. It's about $5 trillion in lost GDP per year globally. So that would be 5% of global GDP. They've also modeled what a potential war would cost. In other words, the loss of access to Taiwan semiconductors. And they estimate it would be $10 trillion per year. So that would be about 10% of global GDP. So if Taiwan were isolated from the international community, if it were cut off, if a war disrupted trade, in addition to sanctions that would likely be imposed on China, I guess from Europe, hopefully from Europe, probably from the US, um, global GDP would probably be reduced about $5 trillion or 5% in the first year, right? US GDP would probably drop 3%, China's would drop closer to 10%. And by comparison, during COVID, world global GDP dropped by 3%. So you're talking 2 to 3 times the impact, economic impact of COVID would hit the world if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan. So I think what's really important is that U.S. credibility towards our allies is really measured in our support for Taiwan. So Taiwan is something of a canary in the coal mine for U.S. credibility. Australian officials would tell me frequently that they watch U.S. arms sales announcements. U.S. willingness to stand up to Taiwan is really an indication of our willingness to back them and support them. So Taiwan is really important, not just for what it represents on its own, but as a measure of U.S. credibility towards the rest of its allies. President Trump has been much more cagey than Biden has been about whether he would support Taiwan in a conflict, but Trump says openly that he also won't reveal his cards, and he sees that sort of uncertainty as a negotiating tactic. But that said, I think U.S. support for Taiwan's defense in the Trump administration has been pretty considerable. Trump's administration, of Trump's big senior appointees in the Department of Defense have really called on Taiwan to increase their defense spending. And Taiwan has responded by announcing they intend to increase spending up to 3%, which exceeds many NATO members. They're also investing heavily in societal resilience, increasing conscription, stockpiling critical material, and also training civilians to support military operations. So Taiwan is investing heavily in its own defense to partly defend itself, but also to assuage the Trump administration. And the first Trump administration approved weapon sales about $18 billion to Taiwan. The Biden administration then approved about $8 billion. And now the Trump administration has indicated he intends to surpass the $18 billion in his first term. So we're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars in arms sales to Taiwan that is supporting U.S. industrial defense industry, but it's also creating much closer military-to-military relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan as U.S. forces train Taiwan how to use all of this new kit that they're acquiring. Congress, of course, is very supportive of Taiwan, and they'll continue to press the administration to defend Taiwan. And I think for the last 15 years, support for Taiwan amongst Democratic congressmen has really increased pretty dramatically. So the National Defense Authorization Act that was just passed includes $300 million in military articles and training for Taiwan. So Taiwan is traditionally, it's a wealthy country. It's traditionally been a cash buyer of U.S. goods. But since 2023, Congress has been authorizing, I think in 2023, Congress authorized $2 billion per year in military financing for Taiwan that would be spread out over 5 years. So it hasn't quite reached the levels of support for Egypt and for Israel and the Philippines, but it's approaching that. So the Congress is allocating resources to contribute to Taiwan's defense as well, just like we do with Israel. So I think Taiwan is really elevated in terms of U.S.-China cooperation. And it's not just because of defense and because of China. I mean, Taiwan is a critical economy in its own right. It's the U.S. seventh largest trading partner. It's the 20th largest economy in the world, and it's the eighth largest in Asia. So I mean, it ranks up there with Japan, Korea, China. So, and as I mentioned, one company in Taiwan, TSMC, has 70% of the market share for the world contract semiconductors. 20% of all integrated circuits are made in Taiwan. And about 90% of the global servers that are used in AI are made in Taiwan. So Taiwan is pretty critical to the future of AI, artificial intelligence. And never mind, about 10% of all the world's computer parts are made in Taiwan or made by Taiwan companies abroad. So Taiwan's pretty important economically to the success and the future of the US, Europe, and Southeast Asia as well. If you compare Taiwan to Southeast Asia, it would be the second largest economy after Indonesia, and it would be the second richest per capita after Singapore. So Taiwan's not insignificant in its own right. Let me very quickly just mention a few things about Southeast Asia and how they're dealing with the Trump administration. I mean, I think ultimately Southeast Asia is pretty stoic about it. Most countries recognize that the U.S. is no longer going to underwrite the existing world order. I mentioned the former Singapore defense minister calling the U.S. a landlord seeking rent. He's absolutely right. Right? The U.S. is seeking partners that were willing to contribute and willing to pay. Economic development and social stability are really the primary objectives of most Southeast Asian states. Most of them are developing economies with very significant internal security challenges, as well as social and economic challenges, a lot of entrenched poverty, a lot of poor governance, corruption. Some Southeast Asian states have pretty significant internal security challenges, insurgencies. Myanmar obviously is large scale. Thailand, Philippines is smaller scale. So there's a lot of non-traditional security threats. They've got a lot of human capital flight, a lot of capital flight as well. And they're really worried about the risk that their own middle classes will shrink and that their hard-won socioeconomic gains will be given up. And I think they're worried that Trump is going to exacerbate and drive that trend. So tariffs on exports to the U.S. really threaten their economic growth and national development, and they're worried that GDP growth will slow. Another aspect, of course, is the Trump administration has cut off development assistance to Southeast Asia as well as much of the rest of the world. And the U.S. was a major development partner in Southeast Asia, I think in ways that people don't really appreciate. So the U.S. previously gave on average $100 million a year in aid, not loans, but aid to Cambodia, which is almost 0.5% of GDP. The U.S. I think gives about 150 million a year to Indonesia and around 200 million a year to the Philippines. And I was surprised when I looked it up, but the U.S. gives about $100 million in aid to Myanmar. Now, of course, none of this goes to governments. It goes to NGOs. It goes to U.S. organizations that do work in those countries. And as a result, it hasn't generated necessarily political support amongst elites or amongst the governments of those countries. But it does build a lot of U.S. support at grassroots levels. And that's potentially being lost. So this also will affect social and economic development in those countries. But Southeast Asian leaders are not complaining about that. And again, a lot of that's going to NGOs, and some of those NGOs are definitely in competition with the government or completely antagonistic to the government. So in some cases, Southeast Asian leaders are not unhappy with the clawback of U.S. aid and assistance in Southeast Asia. It's also worth noting that Southeast Asian countries have all lined up to negotiate new trade relationships with the United States. I mentioned China was the only one that retaliated against the April tariff announcements. So even the Trump administration's rejection of human rights as a pillar of foreign policy and his transactional tendencies are actually pretty appealing to a lot of Southeast Asian states because Trump is a lot like they are. And they feel that they can do business with Trump and they don't have to worry about him supporting dissidents or political opponents or independent media within their borders. So in some cases, Southeast Asian states see the U.S. as a potentially better partner now under the Trump administration. So um, Southeast Asian states are pretty adept at hedging. They've historically always been adept at hedging, balancing their interests between the US, China, Europe, India in distant history. And of course, they have to balance with their neighbor states as well to gain benefits from everybody. So the Trump administration kind of energizes that hedging behavior that they're traditionally very good at. Um, and of course, China is an obvious opportunity for Southeast Asia to hedge. But China's not a perfect partner either. Many Southeast Asian states are cautious about China, so they don't want to become dependent or beholden to Beijing either. So China's quick to retaliate, resort to political, military coercion. There's a lot of territorial disputes with China and Southeast Asia. They don't like how China handles those disputes. So China's not a perfect partner or replacement for the United States either. And of course, China's not going to give the kind of development assistance and replace the US the way some people have claimed, right? Because China has its own isolationists, it has its own poverty. There's no political will or social support or political support in Beijing to start giving cash handouts to foreign countries. They'll give money to state-owned enterprises, they'll finance development, but they're not going to support social movements or social development. So there's a lot of political differences between China and Southeast Asia that a worsening Southeast Asia Trump administration relationship isn't gonna change. And Southeast Asian states don't particularly like Washington's demonization of China. U.S.-China tensions complicates their own politics. And I think in some cases, Southeast Asian states find it easier to blame Washington or U.S.-China tensions for Beijing's own aggressions towards them, because Beijing retaliates and Washington generally doesn't. So, and lastly, as I said, China's economy is not particularly open to Southeast Asian exports either, and many of the countries have pretty significant trade imbalances with China as well. So their exporters are not benefiting from China's economic growth either. So I think that's how Southeast Asian politics in the Trump administration are really going to be characterized for the next few years is more intense balancing, more intense hedging. But it doesn't mean that because the U.S. is behaving the way it's behaving, that China's going to win and the U.S. is going to lose. It's much more complicated than that. So I'll stop there. I think I went a little long, but there should be time for some questions and answers.
Well, I'm sure nobody was falling asleep. Drew, thank you for that very comprehensive presentation. Let me ask the first questions. How do countries in Asia, when they look at the U.S. support for India and the wavering and the up and down, the back and forth, how do they think about that in terms of extrapolating that to what kind of support they may get from the U.S. in terms of a conflict with China over Taiwan?
To sort of paraphrase your question to make sure I understood it, so the U.S. can be ambiguous about its support for China. I think you're asking about how Southeast Asia sees it, right? Southeast Asian partners. I couldn't quite hear if you said Indonesia or not.
Maybe not only Southeast Asia, but also Japan and Australia. Are they looking at U.S. support for Ukraine as a test of what kind of support they can?
Okay. Ukraine is not a perfect model for U.S. Approaches to security challenges. There are definitely some lessons to be learned from Ukraine in Asia. Taiwan is watching the conflict in Ukraine very carefully. It's motivating them to rethink their own defense. Taiwan is investing much more heavily in drones and UAVs. They're investing a little less on counter UAVs and counter drone, but I think they're certainly going to have to work on their own air defense. And that, I think, is one obvious impact. U.S. support for Ukraine has I think another lesson is that the U.S. is very conscious of escalation control and escalation dynamics. We certainly saw the Biden administration, you know, not meet Ukrainian expectations for support either. We heard the Ukrainians in some cases criticize the Biden administration for their caution, saying, we need a partner, not a cheerleader. There was a lot of anger in Ukraine over the provision of short-range ballistic missiles, which came with the caveat that they couldn't use those ballistic missiles against certain targets. And the U.S. lost a certain amount of credibility in how it supported Ukraine at the outset of the conflict. But I'm not sure that's translated to Taiwan necessarily. Now, if you look at Japan, the Japan-US security relationship has strengthened a lot. I think the bigger constraints to strengthening US-Japan security relationship, defense relationship, is really Japanese politics and liberal forces, the peaceniks within the Japanese government who are kind of their own libertarian isolationists who believe that Japan wouldn't have security problems if it didn't militarize. But there is a hawkish faction that wants Japan to become a normal military and shed some of the restraint that was imposed on them following the end of World War II and their constitution. Remember, Japan's military is always called a self-defense force. Japan's military has never operated beyond its own borders, beyond its own 12-mile limit. And that's beginning to change. They're starting to acquire new technologies like Tomahawk cruise missiles, strike capabilities, in other words, the ability to strike ships at sea beyond their own territory and potentially even mainland China. North Korea as well is an animator of Japanese defense. And that's a very different, I think one major difference, of course, is Taiwan and Japan don't share a land border with potential military threats. So their conflict is going to be very different. So US support in technology, in weapons development, in arms sales, integration between systems is also much more important in Japan and Taiwan to a lesser degree. So for instance, US ships in the Pacific can electronically connect to their Japanese counterparts so that you create a knowledge web. You can create a kill chain, as it's called. I think that's much more relevant to an Asian security situation than, say, Ukraine, which fights primarily independently with materiel and a little bit of intelligence support. And I think what support that the US has effectively given to Ukraine is exactly the type of support that Japan and Taiwan have been given. So I think there's a couple of other lessons that can be learned from Ukraine. The effectiveness of asymmetric strategies. Ukraine doesn't have a navy, yet it controls the Black Sea. The amazing effectiveness of land-launched anti-ship cruise missiles has been demonstrated. That's a bitter pill for Asian navies to swallow. Asian admirals see themselves commanding large fleets at sea. No admiral wants to be in charge of sea mines and cruise missiles. They want to be in charge of aircraft carriers and frigates and submarines. So a mind shift is slowly going to take place. A cultural shift is slowly going to take place as they look at the effectiveness of these unmanned systems and what it means for the future of manned systems. And I think Ukraine has really demonstrated that. But that doesn't stop Taiwan from buying US M1 Abrams tanks, which are being decimated in Ukraine by cheap drones. So that conflict, internal conflict, defense planners, military planners between asymmetric systems and conventional weapon systems probably lags far behind Ukraine, but I think it's directing trends. And the US's military, and this is what's most credible, since the evacuation of the very traumatic evacuation of Kabul in 2021. The airlift, everyone remembers the pictures. We were comparing it to Saigon evacuation. Um, in some ways, that was a cathartic moment for the Department of Defense because it signaled the end of our investment and our commitment and our entanglements in the Middle East. And it started a cultural shift within the Department of Defense towards the high-end conflict with China. And we've seen some pretty dramatic transformations within the Department of Defense to prepare for that conflict with China. The Marine Corps, for example, has been the most dramatic. The Marine Corps has given up all of their tanks and all of their artillery and traded them for truck-mounted anti-ship cruise missiles. So the Marine Corps has gone from being able to fight on land to being fight on land in the sea. And as you know, as a bureaucrat, nobody gives up toys. Nobody gives up budget. The Marine Corps has given up entire divisions to transform them into something else, to not fight in the desert, but to fight in small islands. So I think that is extremely reassuring to those Pacific Island states that look to the U.S. for security support.
Thank you, Drew. This is a very good answer. Who would like to have a comment or a question? Duncan? Ladies first. My name, you have one?
How come he isn't talking about North Korea?
So what are your thoughts on North Korea, Drew?
North Korea, thankfully rather quiet. I mean, nobody has any expectation that the political dynamic will change, but North Korean provocations seem to be reduced. I mean, in the short term, you have a liberal government coming in South Korea. Liberal governments have traditionally been pro-engagement with North Korea. So the new president, Lee Jae-myung, is probably going to try to reach out to, I think he's already tried to reach out to Kim Jong-un, to Kim Jong-un's sister, who's a prominent political force as well, to try to achieve some sort of rapprochement, to begin to discuss unification issues, cross-border issues. And I think that gives North Korea incentive to reduce its military provocations. But I mean, the Kim family regime is in a pretty bad dilemma. They can't open their society, they can't open their economy. Their people live in an information bubble that's pretty hermetic. They believe that they're one of the best off countries in the world despite all of their problems. It would be very disruptive for them to allow people to watch South Korean TV and realize how poor they are. So Kim Jong-un is in a real dilemma. He can't open, he can't reform, because if he does, he loses his country. So he has to kind of maintain the status quo if he wants to live, because if he doesn't, he won't. So I think we're looking at stasis in North Korea for this foreseeable future. In the near future, we may see some stability and quiet because of the change of leadership in Seoul. But there's no long-term good news. I think the best we can hope for is he doesn't test nuclear weapons. He reduces his ballistic missile launches that are provocative, going over Japan, for example. And that South Korea kind of leads a period of some form of détente.
Who else? Robin?
Hi, Drew. You mentioned drones and the use of drones in warfare in Ukraine. And the New Yorker radio on Saturday, this past Saturday, I heard there was a discussion of how $500 drone can take out the aircraft on one of our, $5 billion aircraft carriers. So that everyone now is worried about drones. And they went on to say, the speaker went on to say that the CSIS, the Council on Security and International Studies, had just run a simulation war game where they had two teams. One was China. These are many of your colleagues, I think, at CSIS, big tech. one team was China and one team was the US. And the situation was Taiwan. And so the battle began. Taiwan was the Chinese embargoed Taiwan. And within 3 rounds in 2 hours, they were at World War III with nuclear weapons.
They were-
So the remark of the 2 interviewers was simply, well, we hope the Chinese are playing the same games. So they can see how fast this could go. So I don't know what you think about it, but they are your colleagues playing those games. I think all the fellows at CSIS. Are you former?
Sure, happy to give some insights there. I started my career out at CSIS. Jesus, 20 years ago. Maybe let me start with the war games issue, and essentially you're talking about escalation with China. The thing to remember with war games, and I participated in some simulations when I was at CSIS. That's where I first did my first war game, but I did many of them when I worked in the Pentagon. Couple things to remember: they're games; they're not real. And that's by intention. So a good war game tests variables. And a simulation can be computer generated, or it can be a political game, which is sometimes called a tabletop exercise, where you do a simulated national security discussion. And when I teach a class on US-China relations here in Singapore. I use a National Security Council simulation to discuss how we'll deal with a conflict, political conflict. Yeah, so your students emulate and they play, I got a Chinese kid playing the president, a Norwegian kid playing vice president, the Secretary of State is a Indonesian kid, and a Singaporean Secretary of Defense, right? And they all pretend to be working in the White House trying to solve a conflict, whether it's over Japan or Taiwan or what. And that's how they learn US political decision making. But a good one makes those players think about one aspect or one variable and how it affects the dynamic. So you could play a game and you paint a scenario where the US has 25 aircraft carriers and has exquisite air defenses. And then you can see that all your aircraft carriers survive the conflict and can generate sorties and have an effect on the opponent. And it demonstrates to you that your air defenses are great. And that's what you should be investing in. You could run another round next week or a month after, and everybody's air defenses fail and you lose all your carriers, and then see what does that do to your war, your campaign. Doesn't mean that you're going to win, you're going to lose. It's helping you understand the impact of choices that a policy maker has to make. So CSIS has run a number of war games. Many of them have been very public. Quite frankly, I think some of that is attention seeking rather than high quality testing of assumptions, testing of variables. I think the best games are done by other organizations in secret with access to classified information, particularly military information. But when you're doing that political decision making, and many of my colleagues at CSIS are former government officials, so they kind of know what the decision making is. They can do very good tabletops and think about escalation dynamics, but it really depends on the players. And it depends on who's playing red, who's playing blue, red being China, blue being the US. You can have a very aggressive China in your game who starts making nuclear threats, or you can have a more dovish one. I mean, I've painted a picture saying that China wants to focus internally on fixing their own economic affairs, and they're not looking to challenge the US. So if I were playing Beijing in a war game, I would be trying to manage escalation, not escalate to de-escalate, not making big threats, not making preemptive strikes to try to get the other guy to back down. I'd be looking for what they call off-ramps if I were playing Beijing today. But that's one variable. What if you've got a dictator in Beijing that thinks a war is good for his political future? Then your game will have a different outcome, and you're facing nuclear posturing. You're facing nuclear signaling, and you've gone right to the top of the escalatory ladder. So that's the difference in games. the U.S. loses a lot of war games when the Department of Defense plays them, and then that's really so you can see the effect of your investments or the effect of the lack of investments, right? We can win a war in Taiwan, but we lose 3 aircraft carriers and 15,000 troops. Now we can sit there and think, okay, in that scenario, what's the cost? Maybe the answer is more investment in carrier defenses, which was, I think, was your first question about UAVs. Um, I mean, China, obviously, carriers will operate in a certain way in a Taiwan conflict. They're not what you'd call a close-in fighter. They tend to work from very standoff distances. You don't want to put your carriers at risk. These are you don't have very many of them, and they're very large assets, but they're also very impactful. So China has a number of defenses that are intended to challenge U.S. aircraft carriers getting close to the mainland, getting close to Taiwan. One of their most prominent investments capabilities is called the Dongfang 21D. It's a anti-ship ballistic missile, something not many other people have. So ballistic missiles are different from cruise missiles in their trajectory. They're harder to defend against. It takes a different type of defense. And China's has basically developed a ballistic missile that can hit a moving target, which is very difficult. It's not hitting a fixed target like most ballistic missiles are designed to do. Can't use GPS on a moving target. So for your guidance. So that's one challenge. Of course, you have anti-ship cruise missiles, UAVs. I would think a small UAV would not, I mean, the distinguishing between a cruise missile, a large cruise missile, and a large UAV isn't always a useful determination, distinction. A smaller UAV is simply a smaller cruise missile. The issue becomes they're cheap and you can use them in larger numbers, and you probably have more of the cheap, smaller UAVs than you do larger anti-ship cruise missiles. So if you were going to attack an aircraft carrier, you'd want to use everything at once and do what's known as saturation. So you would use UAVs to create a threat profile that has the poor guys working in the screen, the picket, the Aegis class destroyers that would accompany an aircraft carrier and create a circle of air defenses around it. You would be sending an awful lot of UAVs to make them worry about their radar screen and their threats that are coming in, and then think about what are the defenses we're going to use to knock them out of the sky. And if you can get those defenses to waste all of their missiles on low-cost UAVs and then follow them up with much larger, more impactful cruise missiles, you're going to defeat the air defenses. So I think it's that combination of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, unmanned vehicles, all create a new challenge for the air defense system. And this is true for land as well as sea. Sea gets more complicated because you can also potentially put a submarine up against a carrier group, which is why you have submarines that accompany a carrier group. So all of that is hard to simulate if you're not a military official with clearances or don't have a lifetime of career working in the Navy. So good simulations will have people with expertise in air defense at sea, operating carriers, operating behaviors, have good sense of what China's capabilities are, and then they can simulate what they would do, what they need, what they learn from that simulated experience. And that's something the US really excels at doing, is learning from those games and also learning by losing. So when you read in the newspaper or hear about some war game that the US loses, just remember that's by design, and that's to test a variable. And when you lose because you don't have something, or you lose because you invested something that didn't work, it affects your decision making and hopefully makes you better at making those decisions.
I think maybe we'll call that quits.
Yeah.
Drew, thank you so much.